Cool. So without further ado, inviting Prime Minister whenever you're ready.
Okay. Am I visible and audible?
Yep, both.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The government push in this debate is very simple, that the environment and the economy are intertwined and therefore both should be in equal consideration when creating monetary and fiscal policies. The first thing I'd like to note is why the green standards that are going to be used in consideration are likely to be accurate in this debate. So obviously, we're going to use green standards that are, for example, backed by environmental organizations like the UNEP, for example, etc., etc. But the second thing I want to note is what is the extent to which we employ green central banking. So firstly, we think that this will be done in forms where central banks have the ability to do this without trading off people's lives. So in the same sense that we suspend certain monetary policies in times of crisis, that obviously contexts where there's great economic depression, where inflation rises to the point at which people can't afford a loaf of bread, for example, are contexts that are out of this debate. But secondly, we think this looks like encouraging new businesses to hinge their profit models on sustainable business practices instead of having to opt into traditionally environmentally exploitative and polluting practices by virtue of them being cheaper and more accessible. Thirdly, it looks like changing the way in which central banks consider loan giving, for example. So traditionally, loans are given on the basis of things like return on investment. What we do is we add an additional layer of consideration on the basis of environmentalism. So giving green businesses reductions on interest rates for loans, for example. So we think that businesses that are unable to co-opt these practices are not going to die out. They will simply have to pay higher rates, but by virtue of competition, that they're going to be incentivized to also buy into things like green tech, buy into things like shifting production so that they are not necessarily pollutants to the environment. The first argument I'd like to launch in this debate is why the environment is important. So firstly, it's because the greatest polluters, we think that it's because the greatest polluters on the planet are often rich corporations. So these are corporations that opt into things like the oil industry, the meat industry. These are corporations that have factories, for example, in developing countries that like exhume a lot of carbon dioxide and other chemicals into the environment in the environment en masse. And the reason why they do this is because oftentimes it is the cheapest option to opt into things like pollution. Oftentimes it is encouraged within the market to opt into these cheaper business practices by virtue of competition. So we think that even in the worst case then, that only the top companies will be able to shift to sustainability because of this policy, that it's okay because companies like Nestle, for example, are oftentimes pollute at a much higher, more exponential rate than smaller businesses. But secondly, we think that central banks are oftentimes the only actor that can do this. So other means of like supporting sustainability from the state, for example, are unsustainable. It is things like pumping money into green businesses, which you have to continually pump money into. Oftentimes financial incentives come into play. But thirdly, we think that the environment then affects the economy. It is the fact that production is reliant on the presence of raw materials. The fact that supply chains are reliant on environmental factors. Oftentimes harms to the planet are irreversible, which means that these raw materials are also irreversibly like depleted when you do not mine them sustainably. But secondly, we think then that that the environmental harms makes economy building much more expensive over time. So typhoons, for example, that are more frequent in nature because of environmental factors, forces states to rebuild commercial and residential areas, giving them costs that they don't necessarily need to have. We think then that the environment is important both economically, not just because it affects people's lives in the quality of life on the ground, but also because it affects things like whether or not you're able to get energy to certain countries, whether or not you're able to get raw materials to countries that need it because they don't have a large source of material. Before I get on to why it's economically good to implement this policy, POI, go.
The vast majority of economic crises are not due to environmental reasons, but rather political and economic reasons. But moreover, is it really the time during a recession to radically shift your model as a company?
Okay. two responses. The first is that, yes, it's because of political reasons, but these political reasons are exacerbated because of environmental factors. So the fact that we rely so much on oil and coal, for example, means that we're more vulnerable to things like the Russian-Ukraine war in times of political crisis. But secondly, it's not going to be implemented in times of Great Depression or recession, because I told you, we suspend certain monetary policies in times of crisis. It's the but we support a general implementation of this in times where we can actually implement it. The second argument then is why it's economically good to do this. The first is that we're able to get financial support towards businesses. So we think that there's an impetus of countries that are shifting towards sustainable business practices because of pressure from citizens, because people are becoming more progressive, because the harms of environmental damage are becoming more proximate to the everyday citizen in the form of like typhoons, for example, or in the form of like not getting electricity to far off places because of supply chain issues. The problem is that when companies are sanctioned for engaging into pollutant practices because it is the most accessible and available to them, that they cannot pay back these sanctions because of the fact that these are punitive in nature. So even if we don't directly target inflation on our side, we ensure market efficiency, because at least we keep businesses afloat for being good and actually being environmentally stable. But secondly, we think that the financial support that you get on our side are actually sustainable. So the alternatives that opposition has to defend are things like direct funding to green tech, which are short-termist in nature because you have to keep pumping money into this, versus giving them loans that they like discounts on loans that they have to pay back. But thirdly, we lessen inflation because we shift to, again, more sustainable means of production. So again, inflation happens because of supply chain shocks, because there's a lack of supply that's circulating within the economy, right? So if we're less reliant on things that are oil or coal, less reliant on things that are less reliant on raw materials that are not sustainable in nature, that will eventually run out, we think that we're not as harmed by things like what the POI said, like for example, what I responded to in the POI, like war, like stuff like that. But fourthly, we think that technology then becomes more accessible, that there is profitability in investing into green technology because of the fact that companies that have green technology will have discounts on loans from central banks, will not be sanctioned, and therefore will become profitable in nature. And because of the fact that these companies see sustainability as profitable, other companies will also see it as proximate to their own interests to develop green technology that they can sell to other companies. For all those reasons, very, very proud to propose things.
At 10 p.m., inviting Elo whenever you're ready.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yep.
POIs through chat, but past 5, I can take you through voice. We care about the environment because we recognize its impact to people and to the extent to which they could suffer. If we can prove, coming from opposition, that people suffer in the events in which you have these green central banking in ways that are more pernicious, in ways that limit the alternatives that individuals have, in ways that make economies like impossible to be able to recover, we have to win this debate. The first thing I want to point out is that government can't just defend this without saying where this takes place. In fact, they have to defend this happening in most countries as a trend, because that is the main burden of the supports motion. And what this suggests is that this will happen regardless of whether or not you are a developed or developing country. We would suggest, therefore, the harms happen in ingredients, in which the vast majority of development countries who don't already have access to green technology, who find it very hard to be able to afford these things, who still have very infant industries are going to suffer the most. But even if you have to believe that it's only developed countries that this would apply to, or countries with the capacity, it's still bad. We have seen that Germany has suffered the same fate. We have seen that developed countries are the biggest reliers of fossil fuel for their economies, and oftentimes are interconnected with other countries that rely on them. And we see that the biggest harms of our case apply when even only a handful of countries invest in green tech, because that's where prices go up. That's where it's more like expensive. The main thing I want to push coming from this speech is to explain why this worsens financial crises in two levels. One, why this harms industries necessary in stabilizing the economy, especially in instances in which we need to have some financial stability in crises again. But secondly, and more importantly, why is it that this policy creates more volatility and creates crises in the first place? The first thing I want to flag at the top of this argument is that realistically, financial crises is where this debate takes place. And this is because a lot of the decisions that matter for the central bank, things like curbing inflation, etc., really kick in, are really decisions that they have to make in times of crises, because central banks are the only actor that control things like the national interest rates, the borrowing and loans, etc., and like honestly are the most important to this extent. So we would suggest that one, like just by this framing, they have the biggest principle to this on top of anything else, because legislation can fulfill the role of making sure that people go more green. But secondly, and more importantly, we would suggest that absent them being able to rely on this, that is where the first line of defense against financial crises is automatically gone. Wait for me to argue, and then I'll take your POI. So first level, why this harms industries necessary in stabilizing the economy. I want to frame here that a lot of polluting things such as oil and coal have increased in prices post Russia and Ukraine war. But even if you don't believe that, the majority of manufacturing industries actually rely on fossil fuels. And this shows a lot of dependence on things that we might see as brown, we might see as not very green. But why haven't these companies been able to adjust yet? We would suggest one, it's costly. In the past, like 5 to 10 years, we've seen multiple crises. We've seen the pandemic, the Russia-Ukraine war, the China-US trade wars. We've seen bank runs. And all of these have led to things like a lack of capital, because many of these companies, the vast majority of them, are still struggling to survive or struggling to find their footing. But second, we would suggest it's just a hard transition to make. It's costly. And oftentimes, half the power that green energy can provide, the power that green energy can provide is only half of that of fossil fuels, which is why it is often cutting off a lot of their things like production and their ability to earn money. Why then does this happen, and why do we actually make this, like why do we make it worse and make it more difficult to stabilize the economy? One, we would suggest this is very directed towards companies that rely on oil, and honestly also oil companies themselves. And what this means is you are cutting the capacity for them to meet production and therefore not be able to meet demand. And this is because of things like higher interest rates for companies that are not able to adjust, etc., etc. But second, you actually force them to do things like decommission, because the needs of the corporations increase the power needs of the corporations increase every year. But if you do that together with the reliance or the necessity of them to have to cut down on things like what they currently rely on for power, you actually make it far more expensive. But second, if this increases costs, it's actually offset to the consumer, which means that it increases prices, because companies are not going to undercut themselves just to be able to provide the people immediately. And that means that on net, it will become more expensive for a person. A couple of pesos or a couple of dollars might not mean much to the upper crust, might not mean much to the upper middle class, but it means a lot to the people who are the vast majority, the 90% of the world population, whose lives might entirely change if everything increases by that couple of dollars or that couple of pesos. But what this also means is that they become less willing to do things like spend, which means that you have less and less capacity of them to be able to do so. So what this means is that's bad for the economy, for investor confidence, and for just making sure you have money, because you need a decent amount of money for economies to go around. And again, if it's not offset to consumers, you reduce production, it will still push up costs, because the demand stays the same as production cuts down. But thirdly, the way that these crises are solved is lost, because you have less confidence or honestly no confidence in the market. The problem with this is that there's a lot of capital flight, and it's worsened because one, oil is the biggest industry and oftentimes the main industry for a lot of countries. Two, other industries are reliant on oil, even if you don't believe the first level. But finally, there's a lot of uncertainty on these economies because everything is new and this policy is new and seen as unstable. What this therefore means is you just worsen crises that might already exist, and that in and of itself is a harm. Second level, why is their policy volatile and creates more crises? But before that, I'll take your POI.
Yes, your counterfactual is one that defends market neutrality, which means that on your side, there will still be a lot of instability because businesses aren't able to get these loans from central banks.
No, because central banks can choose to do this if they need it for the economy. You have to defend trading that off for the environment. So why is their policy volatile and creates crisis? One, there's increased risk because innovation currently is not properly developed enough for everyone to be able to adapt this en masse, especially, for example, carbon capture prototypes that still do not work. But second, it's very hard to adjust, right? It's very hard to properly create standards. For example, with Germany, the lack of legal frameworks led to consulting firms lying to the success and the criteria of ESG, as we see in the DWS, who partnered up with the central bank. But third, the problem with green tech is that it's just very low supply, which means that if you artificially increase the demand, there's a price push up as the market does not adjust, which means that all the harms we explained in the first argument take effect. But secondly, under this, we would say many countries have regulations on when they can get their tech from. For example, developing countries mostly rely on the US and Germany, and that is why it's hard. The impacts here are simple. One, you increase prices for the average person. That can change their lives. That can determine whether or not they can afford food for the next couple of days. But two, you kill strong local competition to MNCs because the vast majority of countries do not have immediate access to this. But finally, you reduce the ability for people to protect themselves from the environmental disasters that will happen anyway. Because even if the entire world does this now and does it well, people still have to live through typhoons, still have to live through earthquakes, and they cannot move. They cannot do things to protect themselves because they do not have the resources to do so.
I think a lot inviting DPM whenever you're ready.
Can I check if I'm both audible and visible?
Yep, audible and visible.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay. All right. Speech start in 3, 2, 1. In a society where storms, floods, and natural calamities is what spells disaster to the average person living on the ground and wipes out entire food supplies, houses, and lives, we think the future is green, and central banks have to participate in this future as well. 2 things I'll do in my speech. The first is on the issue of economic benefits, and it is on our side where we're able to stabilize economies that inevitably have to shift into being green anyway. The second is just a defense as to why the environment is important, even in the worst case where we do have to rely on some supply shocks, some sort of supply shocks or raise of prices to the average consumer. But also be integrated in my case. The first is on economic benefits. First thing I want to just call out is opposition's push to us that on our side, we defend the fact that most developing countries and countries in general will push to do this. I want to point out that this is actually a good thing because the demand is what creates a market. It signals to companies and to industries that being green and green technology is now a viable alternative. The comparative on their side is that when this is organic is exactly the problem that Nessie points out to you. It's the fact that it's only the few richest states such as the United States and Germany that invest into green technology, and that's why green technology is currently expensive. Like their side is the one that has to defend status quo where it is expensive precisely because there is not much consumer demand for this, and innovation is terrible because no one is looking for this or demanding for this, and people do not want to innovate and build a product that they're not sure consumers will buy. That is resolved on our side, and that's why it becomes cheaper. The second thing is, why are other alternatives like just not enough? So private investment and government investment isn't enough of a signaling effect to the consumer market because they're very limited. Private investment in green technology is not only like optional, but it's also the fact that it's very limited to the few large rich green investing companies. Government investment only works insofar as investors or the market knows that governments are rich, which is not true for the vast majority of developing countries. But when central banks participate into this, producers and markets know that all businesses interacts with the central bank. All businesses take out loans. And that's why it is particular on our side when central banks engage in green central banking that you get the signaling effect that makes that incentivize people to go into green technology that makes it cheaper because there are more companies that think this is profitable. The second thing is that it is on our side where we have more investor confidence. Straight up speaking, on the matter, it is often developed countries that have higher amounts of carbon emission output because developed countries have one, larger consumer bases, but secondly, have the most number of MNCs. Like, it's just true that the top consumers and top carbon emissions are countries like the United States, Japan, and China. So actually, if anything, there's more investor confidence in developing countries, which, because they are nascent industries, tend to, one, have lower like lower carbon emission output, but secondly, tend to be more conservative with the amount of production output, given that their consumer bases are smaller. But thirdly, our side is one that favors local businesses. Note how on their side, in traditional central banking, it's often in favor of MNCs or traditional companies that tend to focus more on indiscriminate mass production because they don't have to care about the environment, because they don't live proximate to this. A lot of local businesses, such as, for example, local farming or local fishing, or literally production of textiles that are done by indigenous and ethnic groups, are done sustainably, and they have no choice but to do this because they're proximate to their environment and have to do this because they literally will starve if they erode the soil that they plant on. So it's actually on our side where economies become more stable because because we incentivize local means of production that tend to be much more sensitive to the environment because people have no choice but to live in that. Whereas on their side, you only favor those that are able to pay back loans, that are able to pay back in larger interest rates. These are often done by corporations that don't have to care for the environment. So it's on your side, the types of companies that you prop up, and ones that are harmful. But second part of this is, why is it inevitable for developing countries or for everyone in general to shift to being green? The first is because these natural resources will run out, right? So it's the fact that you will inevitably run out of oil. It's the fact that you just can't keep on mass producing meat at this rate because it's causing too much emissions and it's eroding a lot of soil and destabilizing other agricultural crops. But secondly, it's the fact that unsustainable means of production is geographically sensitive, and you don't want to build reliance on oil precisely because we literally become beholden to countries like Russia and China if they are able to colonize most of the West Philippine Sea. So we would be okay with taking the trade-off, for example, of these companies having to naturally die out versus an opposition side where these companies die out, but because they run out abruptly, the economy goes into shock. The second thing then is, why is the environment important? But before that, point of information.
So from your speech, it's clear that you want countries to develop their own green techs, which, by the way, they don't have the patents for and don't have the companies for. What is the timeline, or when do you actually solve inflation?
No. It's not just that they will develop on their own. It's the fact that there are more companies, even if it comes from international overseas, that do this. And they know that a lot of companies are willing to sell them. So they're okay with selling it at a cheaper price because they can sell it en masse. These are market incentives for them to spread it out. And just in general, if more companies literally produce green technology and they become in competition with each other, that means that it's more accessible for developing countries, even if they themselves are not able to produce it as a result. The last thing then is why the environment is important. And I want to just engage in our worst case, where the only companies that are able to shift into green technology, or becoming more sustainable, is very few to our extent. Why is this particularly important? The first is because the few companies that shift on our side are the ones that tend to make the most environmental degradation. So it's just the fact that it is the few MNCs that cause 20% of most carbon emissions, that most of the garbage in the world's oceans and most of the landfills, means that if we do get like the tour-free oil companies and large manufacturing companies to ship, that means the quality of life of billions of people improves as a result. But secondly, if these companies do shift to more sustainable means of production, that means that it trickles down to the jobs and livelihoods of the people that they touch. It's just the fact that a lot of the people literally have to live near these factories or on these factories, have to literally interact with these machines to extent. And if it means that they're not as smoke belchant or not as toxic, it improves the quality of lives of people on the ground, and that's why we're very proud to propose. Thank you.
I think DPM inviting DLO whenever you're ready.
Hello, I presume I'm audible.
Yep, and visible.
All right. All right, so I'll take up UI in chat. And yeah. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'll talk about two things and just general contributions from me. Firstly, I'll talk about what change actually exists on either side of the house, why specifically the change that happens on their side of the house is distorted change is likely not going to be beneficial in the long term and sustainable for people on the ground, and why we have on the counterfactual actual change already exists. We simply galvanize it more when the state and the economy is stable. And secondly, I'll talk about what Pandora's box is open when you, for example, have CBs do this and why they will do it terribly. Firstly, then I'll talk about change. They give a couple of mechanisms from their side that are largely uncomparative about why change is better on their side. The first thing they say is that we need to shift investor incentives to develop tech. Both of the, I'll talk about these two reasons, but just note this, a lot of it is contingent on proving these two particular reasons for their side for them to have all of these benefits of shifting the market, having all of this in development, etc. Two reasons that I give. Firstly, they say they need to shift investor incentives so people develop into green tech because they don't have these incentives right now. We need to provide them. So the CB needs to step in through monetary policy. Firstly, they don't prove why it has to be through monetary policy. Again, a lot of the existing mechanisms that we have, for example, are things like legislation, things like activist investing, for example, things, for example, ESG or Western companies that invest in the developing world and get cooperation agreements with the developing world to invest in green technology and transition and decarbonize many of these industries anyways. They don't prove why this particularly has to be through monetary policy. They have to weigh why monetary policy is worth the sacrifice. But two, they don't prove why there isn't natural incentives to go green already, is what they proved from Nessie, because often it is good for you to go green before the advent of it. For example, that you run out of resources, oil is not a sustainable thing. On like many developing countries are already doing this, like India, the Philippines, etc. I'm not sure, but they don't prove this doesn't already happen. But three, let's presume you do agree that if already happens, they just want more extents on it. They kill natural change already exists. Because they say from the previous speaker, you want more companies. But this is nonsensical for the CB to do because they don't want to, for example, fund different people that compete and just naturally are not able to, because they're so small, don't have market concentration to compete with the big oil companies. Naturally going to select certain companies that you get preferential, for example, loans, interest rates, for example, programs, lending programs for them. Why is this incredibly terrible? Because you have market distortion, as what we proved from Nessie. That is to say, these people have large amount of more market power than the quality of their particular products, than their, for example, receptiveness of other people to adopting these particular products in the market. Which means that you have a large scale, the dominance of certain kinds of companies in for example, green tech, but without all of the, for example, efficiency benefits that happen when they've competed with naturally competed, when they've organically, for example, grown in scale, which already exists within these countries, insofar as they don't prove it from government, but they do. What you have is people rejecting these companies. What you have is less quality green tech that isn't able to decarbonize, that isn't able to massively change the lives of people on the ground on their side because you rush the transition and you distort the market. Let's talk about their second reason, which is we have to diminish the strength of oil companies, etc. Firstly, they had to weigh why particularly the environmental concerns is the most important thing. Again, they don't specifically say, they literally concede from the previous speaker, even if some people don't get, for example, economic benefits from this, etc. within that state, that's good. But it's literally the biggest industries within your state and you're forcing them to adopt this immediately. Secondly, I am not sure why they don't just take the risk or they take the brunt of the higher interest rates from brown penalties. Like they're the biggest companies anyways. So their mechanism is reliant on them changing. But if they haven't proven why they will change and why they, for example, can just take the financial risk or financial harm of just having higher interest rates, what this means is it's passed down and the prices are passed down to the average consumer. People are laid off. Communities, for example, have less of welfare, for example, from these companies, etc. Precisely because it's so much more expensive, but they don't want to bite into this because it kills their downline because they're literally not given an organic change to do so. They're forced to do this immediately. So both of these reasons don't stand. Why specifically then does change exist better under our side? One, we approve the incentives for it to happen in the first place. So again, this is going to be important. But two, stability of the economy is the most important thing for all of this green tech to happen. For people to invest in green tech, like locally, for example, or in large scale in companies, they need to feel as if the economy is stable, the interest rates are okay, that, for example, inflation is curbed. For example, for you to opt into these things and transition your business in the long term, you have to feel as if stability is important. You don't weigh against stability. We have stability because CBs have been doing this throughout all of history. We do it better under our side of the house because we do not trade their mandate. I'll talk about secondly on an extension, why it's terrible for CBs specifically to do this. But before I go on to the extension, POI.
So how do you solve inflation from your side? Because you kind of say that central banks can solve inflation.
Central banks have solved inflation throughout most of history. That is their job. That's literally what Jerome Powell does. It's literally what they create all these academic papers to do so in the first place. I'll prove, secondly, in the extension, why it's terrible for them to curb interest rates, but it's just a nonsensical like POI, like just basic economics, right? 3 reasons for why, if CBs will do this, it is a Pandora's box that is terrible for people on the ground. This is not only like responding to their main mechanism that they don't prove, which is that they will do it well, but also explains why under our side of the house, you have a greater capacity to, for example, benefit people when interest rates are targeted properly and have good economic conditions on the ground. There are 3 reasons why they'll do it terribly on their side of the house. Firstly, these people lack specific expertise and capacity. It's literally the ECB, Bank of Japan, Fed, for example, that have academics that have risen through the ranks in bureaucracy by literally being rigorous economists, like saltwater economists like Janet Yellen, Stiglitz, Jerome Powell, etc. They've devoted most of their careers to being independent. They devoted most of their careers to just being economists. You are telling these people that they now have to balance political agendas, all of the pressure that happens externally from like environmentalists, etc., when they do their work, but they've not been educated to do so. But look, here's the nuance, right? Even if Gov says in the worst case, there's some CBs that have educated bankers that have environmental agendas. This is not most CBs. You have to argue why the Bangko Sentral of Filipinas, for example, the Turkish central bank, have CB like people, administrators that can balance these priorities and balance them well. Secondly, they often have to divide their mandate extremely. This is the second reason. Because CBs already do a lot, as what they say from their side of the house, with limited resources, especially during recession. Like scour through real economic data, like scour through craft policy, Keynesian and like neoclassical policy, for example, especially during times of crisis. What you do on their side is they ask you to divide these people who are already overworked in their presence into 2. You have to do, for example, score through economic, environmental like impact for different kinds of companies to balance all of these priorities, balance the pressure that they get, which means that they will do it worsely. Both of these tasks will do it worsely because they're simply more divided. But 3, this is politicization and it's a black hole because when you tell the CB to do something and they have an agenda, it's other agendas that are more pressured to, for example, by the government to do. Like, for example, not just the environment, but specifically like preferential companies that the governments want to do. This is not likely under our side of the house because there is a norm of CB independence that means that governments cannot pressure them and people do not expect that CBs will act with agendas. They can enact long-term policies, which is why it's better under our side of the house for those reasons than proposed.
I think yellow, go for it whenever you're ready.
Hello, just to check if I'm both audible and visible.
Yep, audible, visible.
Thank you. I'll be taking POIs in chat. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. The harms of climate change are irreversible, and at no point has opposition proven as to why they are able to withstand economic policies and economic changes that would benefit them as time passes by. Because opposition, and specifically Jello, can't just say that the central bank is able to solve inflation in the future when it's precisely because of the environmental factors that are shifting businesses and are shifting the way in which we're able to supply all of these productions that will eventually change supply chains, will eventually change the way in which businesses will operate. They can necessarily fiat and they can necessarily posit that the central bank will be able to deal with the ever-changing evolution of how the climate has adapted to our production policies. Therefore, most of the benefits that they provide from opposition are not only unsustainable at best, but at worst do not prioritize the most vulnerable actors of this debate. First, clarification before any issues. The first is I want to talk about what really does this look like, because Riva raises a POI saying that most developing countries will probably left behind behind insofar as they don't have patents to these green technologies? Two easy responses, right? The first is that this is obviously a direct incentive to the top corporations within the market. So it's probably Nestle, it's probably the individuals who, who will see, spending green tech as just spare change for their company. But the second thing is, even if developing countries may be left behind, the fact is, and what changes is that developing countries may be left behind at first. But this is precisely the reason why green central banking should be implemented so that these green technologies will be cheaper in the future. What happens on opposition is that if you rely on traditional banking methods, if you rely on traditional supply chains that obviously favor the rich corporations, obviously favor the corporations that do not at all, prioritize sustainable production, sustainable means of production, means to say that you further the developing world, you further the local producers, you further the gap and the disparity between both rich and poor corporations. The first issue I want to talk about is what should be the priority. I think obviously it's an environment versus economy debate, right? So how are you supposed to weigh this issue? I think the first important thing to consider here is on sustainability, because opposition banking the state economy to its environment that's obviously very volatile and it's obviously very ever changing is unsustainable. Not only is it unsustainable, as we explained from Alex, but it's also irreversible. The effects of climate change are irreversible. The effects of heat waves that you're experiencing right now directly affect the supply chains, directly affect the raw materials that most of these companies get their resources from. What does this mean? Two things. One, you will eventually run out of oil to invest. So the investor profiles, or like the confidence that you get coming from opposition, the benefits that they stand, don't necessarily last too long. They don't prove and they don't engage with the comparative that obviously over time the quality of these resources and the way in which these resources are going to be produced are going to be limited to the top states, but are also going to leave developing states behind. The second thing I want to talk about is obviously quality of production will worsen. This is an inevitable harm that they don't engage in, and it's too late for Riva to rebuild that at WIP. What this means then is the benefits that they get from both Nessie and Jello are at best going to be limited to only 25 years. But furthermore, right, even if you buy the very, very best case that the economy will be stable, that most actors won't be pernicious, that the states will still have the incentive to be green. I think obviously since it's a constant narrative and it's a constant direct incentive that you give to companies, we are able to incentivize change better because obviously there's higher interest rates, there's higher competition, and it's a viable alternative that companies see as legitimate. So even in our very, very worst case, we get the better benefits and it's overall just a net good. But secondly, right, states can't reverse, and there's obviously a political incentive for states to prioritize the environment, even at the cost of raising prices, even at the cost of raising interest rates at the point in which these individuals will, or at the point in which these MNCs will suffer. So this means to say two things, right? One, the harms are more direct and more proximate than opposition. But two, they don't necessarily engage with that worst case. They only bite on their best case. That's incredibly unfair. But let's engage with their very, very worst case, right? Sure. What if businesses will die? What if smaller corporations won't be able to uphold this change? And what if smaller corporations can't survive upon this policy? Two things. The first is this is just broadly incorrect. There are already mitigating factors and circumstances that we frame from Chelsea. Obviously, when there are times of recession, when individuals can't put food on the table, there is incentive for states to regulate this as possible. So they won't probably employ this in the worst possible cases. But two, even if that happens, the businesses that stay within the policies of greener bankings, or the businesses that are able to be incentivized through greener tech, through greener technologies and ways of consumption, are regulated at our very, very best case. So even if Nestle is the only standing company, at least Nestle can be able to produce greener technologies, to produce better, and able to stop climate change to an extent, because they don't solve inflation, they don't solve the worst parts of their case. And as we explained earlier, because of the ever-changing nature of time, they can't necessarily prove that the central bank will be able to solve this in the future as well. Before second issue, POI.
So all of this is great, and governments already do this, but central banks specifically, their only role is to curb inflation and target interest rates. You divide their mandate. How do you solve inflation?
The point is, inflation is incredibly psychological. The fact is, you can't control how consumers behave, and that's probably going to be true within the vast majority of instances in the future when the climate is already bad, when production is already bad, when the raw materials that you get from these different countries are already bad as a consequence to climate change in itself. So you don't necessarily prove as to why the central bank will be able to do its job within the next 10 years. That is something that you had to rebuild at DLO. The second issue then is on disparity, and I want to make this really clear. In status quo, there will always be at the point in which disparity would still exist. But the problem is the type of disparity that you pose on opposition bench. It's one where multinational corporations or the top one corporations are going to be favored for doing unethical and unsustainably environmentally bad and environmentally harmful policies. The objection to this is unclear from opposition. They only say that it's the central bank's job to regulate all of this. They can curb inflation and they can, eventually reallocate these problems to something bigger. We don't necessarily agree that they are able to do this, right? That's something that I already explained in the first clarification. But the second thing I want to note is that at least the disparity that happens on our side is so that the top corporations or the top 1% of these actors don't have pernicious incentives to opt into cheaper and more unsustainable ways of production or methods of production. So even if at our very worst case that disparity will still exist, I think at a point in which you're able to control and regulate the most pernicious actors in this debate, we argue that is the most important consideration at this debate in this point in time. They don't necessarily prove as to why these harms are existent on their side of the house. That is why they lose this debate. Of those being said, vote opposition. Thanks.
Yeah, you got flip up whenever you're ready.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yep.
Two things I want to clarify at the top of my speech. The environment is not the biggest reason for recessions. It is often a result of bad fiscal policies like what happened in Greece, or the result of recent events like bank runs and the pandemic. Maybe they're true about Russia, but that was more of a political thing that even if you, for example, built renewable energy, it is just the fact that developing countries just do not have the capacity to get any other form of energy. They say it's psychological. That is precisely what we do. We market signal, we increase confidence so people spend and therefore curb that inflation. But we also just solve inflation by raising or lowering down interest rates, depending on the model of the central bank, which generally proves us why we do get the problem done. It is very ridiculous for this team to be like, central banks do not solve inflation. That is why they exist. If they didn't solve inflation, they would not exist. First part on the issue on revitalizing the economy. The first thing I want to point out here in terms of a question is, at this point, this team is very inconsistent with their stance. They come up here at first and second to demonstrate that developed countries hold the burden of the environmentalism because they pollute a lot, but they want to, for example, push developing countries to make their own supply of renewable, etc., or they want to push them to make a more expensive purchasing of, for example, green tech. So just by that principle, they're probably inconsistent. But I want to contextualize this issue first. And I just want to point out that their first argument is value neutral. Like, I can agree. Maybe it is true that the environment is really, really important, but at no point do they prove us why it's a central bank that has to, for example, intervene when it comes to environmental matters. There are three reasons as to why we're more important. First, it's the primary goal of the central bank. They need to support, for example, fiscal policies of the government, and the way they do that is, for example, raising or lowering interest rates. But they're also the only actor with this power. They're the only ones who can target inflation, for instance. So I'm just unsure as to why the environment is something that should be in their mandate in the first place. Secondly, they are the prerequisite for environmental policies. For example, in a recession where no one has money, no one is going to be investing into this insanely new infant industry that never existed before. But also, they signal things like investor confidence that typically, by the way, is the biggest reason as to why there is a flock of investment into green resources. As opposed to their side, they have no ability to determine where the economy is going because it is out of their control. It is things that, as we mentioned, have an incredibly hard time to measure, so on and so forth, which generally means you don't have the impetus to develop or pass the most important environmental policies regardless. But thirdly, I think that the economy is just far more important to the environment, especially in the context of developing countries. The first thing is that people are just suffering right now. It is a guaranteed and immediate harm that they're going through. Not 100% of people work beside a coal factory, but 100% of them rely on energy that probably comes from fossil fuel. They might say that, for example, it is irreversible. It is irreversible if you're dead. But more importantly, the reason why we care about the environment anyways is because we care about human suffering. The fact that you can lose a job, or the fact that you live long enough to feel the effects of climate change. So if we say that you have a more certain chance of, for example, suffering from the economy, then presumably it takes precedence for that reason. The government material in terms of response is two things. First, local means of production. The first thing is that this is just insufficient. That is why, for example, a lot of countries like the Philippines, despite the fact that we produce a lot of rice, still import rice because oftentimes local companies and local farmers are insufficient to meet the growing demands of developing economies. Secondly, this is just unclear as to why you're able to do this for all industries. How do you create a local power plant if you never had that resource in the first place? But thirdly, importantly, central banks don't give out loans. So you can just have legislation that, for example, promotes production, like the rice tarification law in the Philippines. I'm unsure as to why central banks are the tipping point. Secondly, the reliance to coal. The only principal justification as to why we hear it's bad is because you're tied to Russia. China has 1/3 of the world's green tech patents. You'd probably have to collaborate with them if you want to develop your own green tech. But I think it's even worse because there are more diversified sources of oil, for example, Latin America or Central Asia, but there are less diversified sources of green tech because they're often concentrated in very rich countries who are able to, for example, bid out other countries, bid out other companies. And that's why they have all of the patents and all of the capacity. Importantly, the way that you should view this issue is twofold. We have two independent pushes. Punishing oil has a massive spillover effect that the economy cannot currently handle. But secondly, green tech investment is inherently risky. Why is this important? Because one, we just have the higher chance of solving inflation, which has been grounded in all speakers as the biggest cause of human suffering, especially right now. But secondly, even if you don't believe that we solve inflation, at least we don't make inflation worse because we don't, for example, encourage investors to go to an industry that's underprepared and lacks proper information. But by the way, also, they don't prove as to why they solve inflation. The second issue I want to talk about then is on environmental transition. Every reason they give, efficiency, productivity, resilience to supply shocks, show that corporations and states have an organic incentive regardless. And it's important. We don't have to prove that our environmental policies are the best. We just have to prove that they are good enough for the goals that we want to achieve, and therefore it does not come at the expense of any form of economic harm. What are the margins of change in this debate, therefore? The first thing is that they encourage risky investments on their government side. Secondly, you rush innovation, and oftentimes it comes at the expense of greater accountability for these newer companies. Thirdly, you artificially increase prices because of high demand. This is important. Their model at Prime Minister was to suggest we will use the UNFCCC standards. That is highly unrealistic because they want all developing countries to decrease their carbon emissions by 80% in 10 years. So I'm unsure why all of the harms they propose are unlikely to happen if they support incredibly radical change in this century. But more importantly, the existence of competition, or if you don't buy that first part, the existence of competition means that companies will get better in the long term. You're forced to be more productive because you're not just one MNC anymore. Oftentimes, now developing countries are creating to multiple MNCs in the same industry, but also you just have more corporate accountability. With the rise of things like, for example, shareholder activism, etc., or just increased competition in general, which often means that you are forced to do things in the most efficient or productive way regardless. Before I go on to talk about the harms of a rushed transition, I'll take the POI.
So all of your very, very big harms, things like the oil industry dying abruptly, they don't happen because we framed at the top that this big businesses, if they really are so rich, will not die out. They'll just have to pay higher rates, which is good.
Yes, but they offset it to local businesses, which employ 80% of your population. It means that the average person has to spend more for energy, which means that they don't have money to spend on their essential goods or other things. You still harm people. Let's talk about the harms of a rush transition. Their response to a lot of our harms is to suggest that we increase supply. First, if they say it's a lucrative industry, which in status quo it already is, and so that means that if ROI was a good factor for companies, then companies would have opted in regardless and have the natural incentive to develop green tech, which by the way, they are currently developing anyways. But secondly, it takes a long time to develop climate tech. So for example, you have high prices for the short to medium term. It's unsure as to why immediately developing countries will be able to afford it. But the second thing, which is unresponded to, is that the value of green tech is incredibly hard to value. It is the fact that, for example, Germany's largest asset manager, the DWS, literally published false information about, for example, carbon neutrality with a lot of German companies, which influenced the German central bank's decision to invest in to the German central bank's policies. And it's important because if you lack information or you lack, for example, success cases of prototypes, you create market distortion, which often means that you don't match the actual value of the stock, which means people even make worse investment because they don't have information for the entire market. For those reasons, side with opposition.
I thank Opwip. Moving on to Op reply whenever you're ready.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yep, audible and visible.
Okay, great. The biggest flaw of government is that they believe that this is an environment versus economy debate. They're willing to save the trees for future generations and still be able to see the green pastures. But for these future generations to exist, or to be able to find the time and energy to take in the beauty of the world, they need to be free. Free from hunger, free from working 2 to 3 jobs just to put food on the table, free from NNCs that are very likely to jack up prices and pretty much hold you and captured because they have ultimate power. This is a timeline debate. We never said we would fully trade off environment. What we said was the environment and economy need to be balanced out, and oftentimes the ability for you to one, enjoy the beauty of the environment, but two, be able to protect yourself from the harms of the environment and the ways it can hurt individuals that will exist in either world because we are trying to undo what has already happened are things that people should be able to protect themselves from, and that is what we provide. What I want to deal with broadly is this whole issue on the timeline debate, and why specifically, even if you do believe they're large benefits, they just are not something you can weigh as important in this debate. I think Riva does a great job of just killing everything, so let's wait. Their broad claim is that more countries will demand more green tech, so more companies will produce it and prices go down. And the problem is, which we point out even at first to no response, is that it's the time lag. One, that most existing green tech are still prototyping or just not as efficient to meet the demands of a growing population. So what this means is that you trade off the ability for people to afford their own necessities or trade off the ability for companies to be able to produce these things to exist in the first place because there's a lot of downtime that comes with investing. But second, it's also that you either force local firms to develop their own, which is also expensive, which is also harder for them to be able to access for the vast majority of countries, or you wait for international firms to figure out how to scale its production, which is a different thing entirely than creating something, which takes a lot more time and money as they build factories and build ways to produce this in a way that is scalable enough to meet demand. And since they rely on the market signal of demand growing up before creating that supply, there's already going to be time lag. But even if you don't believe the first two things, the fact is, and we explain it from the top, companies still have to adjust. They still have to spend on it right now, which means that changing the technology they use is still them having to overhaul already existing systems that have been tried and proven to be good. And what that means is that in that interim period, all our harms manifest. They say that the environment is irreversible, but so is getting in debt. So is closures of businesses that you've invested on that have led you to probably debt, to probably like having to starve, etc. So are the long-term effects of starvation and malnutrition. And so are the long-term effects of an economy pretty much losing a lot of their money and losing a lot of investor confidence. At this point, the best case in their world is that suffering is symmetric. But in their world, you would say one is far more proximate to the average individual because the effects of a recession can come in the next 6 months. We don't know when the next environmental big thing will happen, but a heat wave is not as bad as these because at least if we are able to protect them economically, they can protect themselves with the resources they have. But here's the kicker. Their mechanism of demand and signaling supply relies on these businesses, one, existing in the first place, and two, these businesses surviving through these crises. Note that these are all things we frame are likely to not like that these are all things that are not likely to happen in LO speech, but they never really respond to it. And so what this means is if they're not able to prove that either of these things happen, because they never prove how they solve inflation in the first place, you therefore lose the very mechanism that they explain will lead to green tech being more accessible. And this means that their entire case crumbles. And what their world looks like is economies in shambles, people starving, businesses dying, in the hopes that perhaps we will signal to these big international firms that create green tech that we can export to them, that we can sell to them. When the very fact of the matter is they will have no more money to afford it. In our world, we keep these structures of CB meritocratic and united, but more importantly, we make sure that people can live to see the day in which the best effects of environmental legislation are something that they can live through.
And then I'll reply to conclude the debate. Just reply whenever you're ready. Garth reply, I don't think your camera is working. Or at least it doesn't. It looks like, yeah, it looks like a blank to me.
Okay. Hello. Sorry, I got disconnected. Can I check if I'm audible and visible?
Yep, audible and visible.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry for that. All right. Speech start in 3, 2, 1. It is precisely because we need a balance of both the environment and the economy, because currently status quo over prioritizes the economy, that we have to support green central banking. It's not an opposition bench. Like, mind you, the introduction for all three speakers was why the environment is not important and they will fully prioritize the economy. It was on our side where we considered the nuance that the environment and the economy is intertwined. But the second thing is, I want to point out that we've been charitable to all of opposition's demands. The first is, what if developing countries are left out? The first is, we are able to resolve this, that currently developing countries are being left out, as they've explained themselves, that there are large patents, that it's often very expensive, and that's why it becomes more affordable, because not only do green central banks give them the capacity to do so by giving them favorable loans, it's the fact that there is now a market for it, and it's a signaling effect, and we allow them to have more options because more companies go into the green tech industry, precisely because central banks signal that it is a profitable cost to begin with. But the second criteria then the input is, what if big corporations are the only ones who go green? We explained why this was okay, because it's oftentimes the largest corporations that make the largest harms anyway, and not the nuance of what we explained. That traditional banking will still have preferential treatment for large companies, right? The fact that they will still be able to be the ones who borrow the largest loans, have the best risk portfolios, and will be able to take advantage of traditional banking on opposition side. So the crucial difference is, if big oil and big MNCs will get loans anyway, we might as well force them to go green to do so, because the amount of pollution and unsustainable practices literally hurt people on the ground. The last thing is that we explain that this will not be passed on the ordinary consumer, because companies still compete in the free market. Like, literally, they will lose out to the local businesses that get more favorable loan interest and are able to sell their products cheaper because they were more sustainable to begin with. But the last thing is on whether or not the economic aspect was important, and we engage on that as well. The first thing we argued was that developing countries and all states in general need to be inevitably more sustainable, because most of their raw resources and stuff are limited and they will run out, or are reliant on socio-political conditions that we are unsure if we can predict. And that's why it was important for sustainable companies to not die out and to encourage more on them on our side. But secondly is that our side favors local production. Like, note how they don't make a response as to how most locally produced items tend to be more sustainable compared to the average MNC and mass-produced things that are more favored in traditional banking. So it is on our side that economically you're just more stable because you champion local businesses. What they don't engage, and at the end of this portion, we are charitable on opposition because we engage on all of the questions they posit. But on the other hand, what they don't solve is, first, on inflation. Like, number one, they don't explain what the counterfactual on their side looks like. Where do the numbers come from? Why is it not politicized? The best thing we do is, what we get is that, well, in the past, central banks were able to solve inflation. That is not sufficient for the debate. They have to explain it in the same way as they burden us to explain why that's possible. But secondly, we question that inflation is often psychological in nature. The comparison is carbon emissions that at least you can ground on particular number and have the scientific means of backing as to how you can resolve it. The second thing is that they just don't engage onto the idea that the environment is important. It's a fact that smoke belching factories poison citizens. It's a fact that pollution harms people. These harms are urgent. We didn't just argue in the long term. But secondly, we explained that these harms are irreversible. The point is that we can't take back carbon emissions or pollution that already does damage to people and lives. And lastly, where do we draw the line? They said that we need to have organic change, but we argue that this is often irreversible, and over time that it becomes more expensive if they really want to run that. For all those reasons and more, not only do we prove that our side gets better, we'd say that it's all right that we have the birthing pains now if it means a better future for people tomorrow. Very proud to propose things.
I think that's reply, and thank everyone for debate. For the observers and debaters, you guys may leave the breakout room, and for the judge to proceed to deliberation. Good luck and all the best.